Wow, the economy of the indentured servant and the slave was definitely an economy that was regulated to protect the employee. Let me give you some examples from a law review of 1877. The court ruled that an indentured servant that was too lame to ever work again still had to be employed and supported by his master. And I quote, "The master has care of the slave, for better or for worse." An indentured servant working for the railroad company was injured, and the court rewarded him. He was able to sue the company and get compensation from the corporation. An apprentice that was going to work for a multi-partner firm could require every partner to sign his indenture contract, thus obligating them to stick strictly to the terms of the contract while he apprenticed for them. There's a great law about limiting the scope of work of the contract. So if the employer or the master asks you to do work that was not specified in the indenture, that is a breach of contract. If he wants to add work or add tasks to your contract, they have to renegotiate it and have it approved by a judge. Clearly, indentured servitude and slavery were heavily and detailedly regulated, and you can see how they had protections for indentured servants, apprentices, and slaves. In the case of a contract where the price might not be specified, the servant could simply apply to the court, and the court would rule for the servant based on the typical wage or rate paid for that type of work. And in other cases, it's easy to see the judges making the point that the indenture is a two-way street, that the master has obligations to the apprentice, and if he doesn't meet those, then the contract is void, or the apprentice might be able to sue for damages. So these are just some example among hundreds that I've already seen. What is overwhelmingly evident is that it was heavily regulated: indentured servitude, apprenticeship, and slavery. And the idea that typically the masters were beating their slaves or whipping their apprentices seems highly unlikely. Further supporting this theory is that the law also makes it clear that the masters have to provide adequate living space, food, and clothing. And typically, even that's negotiated. I've seen contracts that require 200 pounds of pork per year. Okay, so it's not that there was one standard contract. It's that there was a standard body of law setting like the minimum acceptable requirements and how you treat a slave and what a slave or a servant or apprentice is to receive in terms of material support. This system stands in stark contrast to the modern free labor system that we've had ever since the Civil War. I would almost say the previous system was a form of socialism and feudalism, both as they had arose in an agrarian society. The fact that we had such a different labor and economic system prior to the Civil War demonstrates that the Civil War was the culmination of a reset, and that the new faction was determined to implement its northern industrial capitalist economic system. Remember, this is the same system they had implemented in Great Britain since the late 1500s. To make that point, the British East India Company is created in 1600. The Bank of England is created in the late 1600s. So, by 1700, they had their capitalist system implemented in Great Britain. After forming the United States, they then fought about a 100-year war that culminated in the so-called Civil War, in which they finally got to implement coast to coast their version of an economic system. I hope you enjoyed listening to this and it gave you some food for thought.